Welcome to the Regulation podcast from the Institute of Regulation. My name is Martial Bou, Chair of the Institute and a regulator myself. This month's podcast asks, how do you chair a regulator? Non-executives play a crucial role in regulators, leading strategy, making appointments, and taking responsibility for regulatory decisions. What are the particular challenges faced by regulators, non-executives, and chairs? How can they play these roles effectively? And what should executive staff in regulators do to work effectively with their chairs and boards? We have two very experienced speakers to give us answers. Jo Clift is chair of the General Osteopathic Council and a non-executive on the board of the Vets Regulator, RCVS. Jo was previously on the board of the government's internal audit agency, a senior civil servant in the Cabinet Office in Downing Street. And she set up the Centre for Public Appointments and has worked to improve the calibre of non-executives on public boards, including by conducting board effectiveness reviews. So lots of relevant experience. Thank you for joining us. Welcome.
Hello. Hi.
Good to have you. And also with us is Helen Phillips, the chair of the General Dental Council and of the Chartered Insurance Institute, and previously chair of the Legal Services Board, the oversight regulator of the legal profession. Helen is also on the board of the Gambling Commission and was previously on Social Work England's board. And before that, Helen was the founding chief executive of Natural England alongside many other roles. It's an impressive regulatory career. Welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Marcel. Hello, Jo.
Hi.
Now, thanks again, both of you. So before I ask you about chairing regulators, can I first find out how you got to where you are? Maybe something about the specific regulators that you chair now too. What led you to become a chair of a regulatory body and why these ones in particular? Jo, can I come to you first?
Yeah, sure. So my main career was in the civil service, mainly in central government, often belonging to the Cabinet Office and looking at how we change the way departments work across the whole of Whitehall. I've always enjoyed board work, committee work. So when I left government, I started being a non-executive director. And one of the roles I had was being on the board of the membership organisation of the osteopaths. And that led me into applying for the chair role. So I've had sort of 6 or 7 different board roles, and I run what we call board effectiveness reviews. So I go into the boards, often of regulators actually, and do a review of how their board is operating. So the osteopaths regulator, our profession has been regulated for about 30 years. We have just over 5,000 registrants. And obviously we're protecting the public. We're setting professional standards for osteopaths, checking the quality of the education, running the fitness to practice regime. And we sit across all 4 nations in the UK.
Okay, well, that's a great grounding in the kind of issues that chairs will face, obviously, both from your previous executive experience and now with the osteopaths. Helen, as I mentioned earlier on, you've done various non-executive roles. Was that something that you had always wanted to do? And tell us something about the General Dental Council.
Absolutely not something I'd even thought about, if I'm honest. I was very busy and full on in an executive role when I got approached about chairing my local hospital. And I was in my late 40s, and I remember thinking, oh, that'd be a really interesting thing to do. And I actually said to the headhunters, you might like to ring me back in 10 years. So one thing led to another, and I went to have chats and explore the opportunity and thought I really would love to do that. So I've done exclusively non-executive work now for the best part of 12 years. And as you say, I'm at the GDC now. I'm not long at the GDC. I'm about 6 months into that role. And the GDC is a frontline healthcare regulator. So I've had some experience of that in the past because I was on the founding board of Social Work England, I think, as you mentioned. But the thing that has helped me, I think, a bit in various chair roles is the kind of breadth of regulation. Because, I mean, in my youth, I started out working on heavy metal pollution in food chains and went from there to the National Rivers Authority and the Environment Agency. So I started it as an environmental regulator, and then I became a legal services sector regulator. Then I did some healthcare regulation. I'm also currently a gambling commissioner, where you're kind of getting a different approach on the sector. So they're all kind of interesting in that you get to see the kind of full gamut of regulatory levers, being applied to different conundra in different sectors, which is very satisfying because there is a real art to regulation. And, I've been lucky enough over the years to work with some people who are very expert at it. So it's been great.
It's fantastic. Well, the Institute of Regulation has about 80 corporate members spanning the full range, I think, of economic regulation, professional regulation, and regulation of public services as well. So both of you collectively, I'm sure, will have a lot to bring to this conversation. So let me kind of get straight into the regulatory piece and ask you what you think good regulation looks like. So before we move on to talk about your roles as chairs, just in a nutshell, Helen, let me stick with you for a moment. What does good regulation look like to you?
Well, I think you have to say all the words anybody would expect you to say in answer to that question, which is proportionate and modern and risk-based and consistent and all of those good things that we all know regulation is meant to be. For me, there's something a bit more esoteric, actually, that sits behind that. And it's come to me very much more forcibly since I've started chairing the Chartered Insurance Institute, because the Chartered Insurance Institute is not a regulator. It's a professional standards body. The regulator is the FCA. And we all talk about, don't we, where regulatory minima meet professional standards and good practice. And you kind of appreciate that that is a thing. But when you have the joy and pleasure of seeing both things go on at the same time, it reinforces for me that the pride professionals take in their own brand and the quality of the service they give to clients or patients is a much bigger protection than any amount of regulation will ever be able to afford. So I think regulation, particularly professional standards regulation, needs to be done in the public interest through and with the professionals, rather than doing things, regulatory things onto professionals, hoping that is going to add up to public trust and confidence. And that might sound a bit semantic and subtle, but I really, really believe that.
It's fascinating. And for those people who regulate professionals who have that ethos, that kind of professional ethic, I'm sure that will resonate. Harder when I regulated MPs, but it will depend on the profession. So, Jo, coming to you, because obviously you've got experience of professional regulation yourself now, but also more broadly, what does good regulation look like from your point of view?
Well, I agree with everything that was said, but I think you have to start from the position that you really want to run a sort of highly effective organisation and run really excellent fitness to practice processes. So you have to get all the kind of housekeeping right. What I'm thinking is that often regulators are very misunderstood and feel very misunderstood by some of their stakeholder groups. So one of the things that I think really excellent regulation involves is really, really clear communication and dialogue with stakeholders. So, for example, in our legislation, we're not allowed to promote osteopathy. But many of our registrants feel that we should be doing that. And in fact, that's done by the Institute, not by the regulator. So you need to be really clear with everybody what you're trying to do for them, whether that's the public or the registrant or your stakeholder organisations, and spend time, in the room having a really good dialogue and accepting that you won't always agree with each other.
Okay. Well, some important words there. Helen, you mentioned all of the words that we know: proportionate, fair, risk-based, and Jo, you picked out the importance of communications, engaging with stakeholders. So coming on to your roles as chairs specifically.
Just before we do, Martha, yes. Jo has pumped another thought, if I can just add very quickly.
Of course.
And it's relating to strategy. It's so important, I think, that regulators don't have strategies that say we're going to do X of this and Y of that. And by the end of this period, we will have spent, Z. All of those things are, of course, very important and need to be diligently executed. But unless and until you put yourself through the pain, and believe you me, it is pain, of describing the outcomes all that activity is going to add up to. not just from the perspective of you as the regulatory body, but from the perspective of those you work with and serve, whether it's registrants or whether it's patients or whether it's people who can't get access to services. And I think, and it plays into, I think, what you're going to come on to, Marcel, about the chair role. I think that's really an important thing to do.
Well, it absolutely does, because as chairs, part of your role, obviously, is to set the direction for the organisation and to kind of keep people's sights raised to those outcomes that you've just described. So this is not just a regulatory issue, but it's the role that you have chairing any public body or indeed a private commercial enterprise. So how do you approach those kinds of strategic issues and the kind of things that all chairs need to be thinking about? Good governance, financial management, appointments. What's your approach to that? Helen, let me stick with you and then I'll come to you, Joe.
Well, if I'm just to kind of pick up where I left off, I suppose, I always think the role of the board is fourfold. It's about strategy, it's about scrutiny, it's about stakeholders, and it's about setting the tone and culture of the organisation. So I've just said a little bit about what I think is really important in the strategy process. And I think, you don't want a group of people on a board who are like the Stepford wives, they're all reciting the strategy. But I do think you need a shared vocabulary about where it is we're taking the organisation and what good looks like. And then the scrutiny bit for me is not allowing yourself to be drowned in exactly the same performance pack that the executive are in the middle of. You need all of that taken up at least 2 levels about what are the small number of key outcomes that the board is really going to have stewardship of. And of course, unless and until you do that, which is hard again, your whole approach to risk can become a nightmare, because you're on page 45 of the risk register, at which point you've kind of lost the will to live. So, if you have a small number of strategic priorities you're measuring, you then have a relatively small number, hopefully, of risks that are mapping directly onto those. And then if that's all working well, and I appreciate a huge amount of work goes into this by our governance colleagues and making all of that work well, it's easy for us to describe. There's a huge amount of work that goes into making, less is more. But it also, I think, helps you think more particularly about your stakeholders. And Joe's already talked about the importance of stakeholders. But, I'm a huge believer in the customer in the room. And I don't mean, somebody giving a report on the customer in the room. I mean the actual customer in the room. So I think the more of that you can do, the more it grounds and roots conversations in the boardroom. The final thing is about culture. At the end of the day, the board is accountable for making sure that there are a clear set of values in place. That's the heavy lifting, and that's often done by not only by the executive, but by hopefully everybody in the organisation having a say in shaping those. But it's so important that the board role models them. And, each value in an organisation can have a different but consistent expression depending on what part of the organisation you're in. And boards do need to spend a bit of time thinking about if our colleagues were to look in at us, how would they know we too are living these values?
Goodness me. Well, there's a massive amount there. Joe, do you want to just pick up on some of that and also just say from your perspective, including the reviews of board governance that you've done, what are those kinds of non-executive roles that you think boards ought to be leading?
Well, you've both covered a lot of ground there that I had written down here. However, when we go in and do the board reviews, I'm looking at it from 3 different angles. So strategy, the processes and performance management is the second one, and then the culture and the tone is the third one. So why strategy is essential is because everybody has to have a shared view of the direction of the organisation. And often if you go in and do board reviews, you might hear actually from individual NEDs that they have a different perception of the direction and priorities of the organisation. So you've already got an issue there. So the strategy has to be, what's our destination? And then the board have the key role in understanding, are we on the right track to meet that destination? Have we taken a wrong turn? Have we got enough money? What's going on? which is where the sort of medium-term planning and horizon scanning comes in, and the performance management. And Helen's absolutely right that if you're drowning in the detail of the risk register, or if you're drowning in the detail of the business plan or the dashboards, it's really hard for the NEDs to see, is the organisation actually progressing against the strategic objectives? So often when we're working with boards, we're trying to help them get to what we call a median level of KPIs. So it might be sort of 8 KPIs that just allow the board to keep a sort of temperature check on where things are going. But of course, when you boil all of that down, it comes down to people and tone and relationships, and how you work together. And I mean, we're going to talk about the executive a bit later on, but the sort of classic trap is that the executive feel that the board are interfering, and the board feel that the executive aren't giving them enough information. So you've got to try and keep the ship balanced across both of those directions, really.
Goodness, there's a lot of commonality. Helen, do you want to just come back on some of that?
Just love to pick up on Joe's last point about the executive, because, boards can sometimes be victims of their own requests. Because if they're not feeling assured about it, oh, can we have this and can we see that and more of the other? And you think to yourself, oh, no. And I think when there's high levels of trust between the executive and the board members, the executive colleagues are much better at asking why. Why would you like to see that? What is it that's really bothering you? What is it that what is it that you would need to know in order to feel assured, rather than saying, oh yes, of course, we go away and get you 10 more pages, because it kind of gives you a race into a rabbit hole. But executive colleagues don't always feel comfortable to do that, which goes back to Joe's point, doesn't it, about having the right tone that then promotes the right sort of conversation, so that it is a safe space to look together at tricky issues.
And I know we're going to come back to some of this perhaps, but just on this question of trust, because it is such a crucial thing. The roles are different, non-exec and exec roles, and yet you're all trying to push in the same direction. So how do you make sure that, albeit that the non-executives come in once every couple of months to do the scrutiny and oversight and strategy setting, that you can build that trust with those people who are working 5 days a week, say, in the organisation? Helen, do you want to kick off, or Joe?
Well, I feel as though I've got a book in me on this one. So, so I think you have to get to know each other, and you have to get to know each other as people. So the NED group has to get to know each other, and how they want to work together. And the NEDs and the executive, the team, the senior team, have to get to know each other as well. And there's various, ways of doing that. And then it's all about the quality of the dialogue and the quality of the listening. And going back to where we were with strategy, the clarity about where everybody's heading and what the priorities are. It's terrible if you're an executive and you feel that the priorities are moving all the time. So all of these sort of bits of the jigsaw fit together. But when you boil down the trust issue, it's all about relationships, openness, transparency, and a sort of a shared endeavour. And trust comes and goes on a board. It's not always a constant kind of temperature.
Mm. Helen, any tips that you've got to help build trust?
I really, Joe's first point about getting to know each other really resonates with me. And on a number of my boards, we have dinner together the night before the board meeting. And of course, in the public sector, you really can't do that. We all have to, bring our sandwiches in our brown paper bag or whatever it is to the actual meeting, let alone meeting the night before. But I think if you can do that, it can sometimes be a relatively small investment for a huge payback. It's also a nice environment in which to invite others, So if you want a perspective from a stakeholder about something you're going to be wrestling with the next day, that can work well. But I appreciate it can't work in all contexts because of, various constraints and limitations. I think the only other thing I'd add really is about role definition. And I think a lot of the time when people are having incursions into each other's space in either direction, with the Ned's going across the line into an executive space, or executives feeling overly, I don't know, scrutinized or anxious, is sometimes actually about a lack of definition about what the responsibilities of the two roles on the board are. And often, if you think, God, this is all a bit peculiar, if you spend kind of a day together as soon as you recognize, or half a day, or sometimes it only takes a couple of hours, saying, what are our respective roles and what does that mean for the delegations? And do you understand as executives why the board might be feeling a bit exposed because their accountabilities actually sit here for this decision? Whereas executives are really being diligent, but they're anxious, feeling all the accountability sits with them. And I think sometimes when you lift some of that sense of them being solely responsible or accountable for this into the sense that actually in a public-facing sense, this is a decision where the mind of the organisation, i.e. the board, is going to be more publicly scrutinised and accountable. It kind of helps everybody kind of work better together. And it's easy to overlook doing that. And particularly if you sit on a number of boards, you think, we did that recently. You think, well, actually, no, we didn't do that recently here. Yeah. So It is important to keep that fresh.
Yes. Great. Well, those are some really practical tips there. And I'm going to come now specifically to your roles chairing regulators, because some of what we've discussed now is relevant to all boards of public bodies and other organisations. But in terms of regulatory boards, obviously, as a regulator, you're independent to a degree of politicians and government, but also accountable to them. And you've, as a regulator, got complex risks to manage, making judgments where some people may not agree with the decision. You're balancing harms, imposing burdens. And also, as chairs, you are the public face of the regulator, sometimes on the media and certainly to Parliament. So you're quite exposed. What are the skills that you need as a regulator chair? Jo, let me come to you first.
I actually don't think this is that complicated. I could be oversimplifying, but I think it just takes you back to the clarity of the role. So we have a very clear role with our profession about what we're responsible for and the steps that we take to enable that at the General Osteopathic Council. A lot of the scrutiny in our profession is much wider than our role, doesn't actually sort of cross our territory. So you just have to be really careful, first of all, about what your role is. There's a sort of realpolitik here. If you are the chair of a regulator, you may have a medium or high level of exposure, and I think that just goes with the territory. And most of us have worked with ministers, senior stakeholders, parliamentarians in the past, and generally speaking, what you need if something's stressed or going wrong is you just need to have a dialogue. You don't get into a room and say, well, why did you do this and why did you do that and what's going on? You just have a dialogue. Everybody's a grown up. So I actually think it's slightly more straightforward than your question implies. I mean, I've just come back from a conference in Austria where all the European osteopaths were getting together, and we were looking at common issues that we can work together on. Obviously, that's got more complicated since we left the EU. And if I was chair of the General Medical Council, I mean, clearly I'd be worrying about the media probably every day and every night. So it does depend on your role. But actually, I kind of think that's what they're paying you for when you're a chair. They're paying you to sort of to step up if something goes wrong. And the early part of my career was in communications and ministerial communications. So I actually quite enjoy that part of the role.
Good. Well, that sounds very straightforward then. Helen, from your point of view, chairing a regulator, Are there some specific things that you think are necessary for those roles?
I would endorse everything Joe said about, handling the kind of top of the shop and the ministerial relationships. So the additional thing I draw out, I think, is about tough decision making. Regulators often have to make tough decisions or finely balanced decisions or sensitive decisions or decisions with great repercussions for one or more parties. And I think the kind of best thing in your armory around all of that is transparency. And to have absolutely the bare minimal in any sort of private session of the board of the council, to keep as much as you possibly can in public view, to do your agonizing out loud. It can be uncomfortable, and it's particularly uncomfortable if you haven't exercised that muscle for a while. But I think stakeholders and the public are very very grown up if you treat them in a very grown up way. Yeah. And they understand the subtleties and the nuances. And, even if people are not getting the answer to the decision they want to know that it has been thoroughly examined and properly taken. So I think that's a really important thing for an important way for chairs to lead and an important way for boards to act.
Well, I think that's fantastic advice, I have to say, to treat people with respect and as adults, including those who you regulate, as well as in the media. Obviously, there are lots of adults out there all over the place, but there are some people who will play games. And so, you need also to prepare for those eventualities, I'm sure. I've heard you both talk about the importance of relationships. Building those relationships with the executive, with the senior stakeholders, with politicians, obviously as well. The importance of bringing the team together, whether that's the non-executives or the executives and the non-executives. Having people in the room. You've both said the importance of listening to those stakeholders too. Before we end, I just want you to maybe share any particular tips that you have for executives, because most of the people that we have in the Institute are executive members of regulators and, working in various functions, working with boards, with chairs. So what advice would you give to people in the midst of their regulatory career when they're wanting to work with chairs and boards? Let me start again with you, Helen, and Joe, I'll end with you if that's okay.
To answer a question with a question. Because we are in a fortunate position. We work in great regulatory bodies with lots of people with lots of knowledge who can answer questions. But sometimes the greater art is in defining the question or identifying the issue fully and properly. And I think executives, and I know I certainly felt this as an executive, particularly if you're asked something by somebody at the board, you must have an answer. Oh, must have an answer. And that's to completely overlook the value that a chair will put on you, helping them tease out the question. Yeah. So I think it's really important to be as comfortable, to be, collectively curious with the chair and the board.
Fantastic. Well, that's, again, an invitation for good team working, isn't it? To help work out answers collectively together, because the kinds of challenges regulators face are complex sometimes, as you say. There's balanced decisions that need to be made. Joe, from your point of view, what advice would you give to people?
So it's sort of similar, but related. So I think it's about helping the board understand the actual question that's on the table. So when you're very close to a particular topic, it's very easy to feel that you, need to give a lot of information to board members and not necessarily understand that you need to walk them through, what's the history of the issue, what's the real question that they need to start to address. And guide them through that process with the papers that you're writing. And try and imagine what it's like being in their shoes. They're only reading your papers every few weeks. They're not dealing with the topic every day like you are. So try and write it from the perspective of a non-specialist, as if you're trying to explain it to, your friend in the pub or whatever. And this is a really interesting way of looking at the relationships, because executives can often feel frustrated about boards not being experts in the detail, but that's where the balance is. And actually, that's where the good marriage of executive and non-executive skills comes together. But we really need as much clarity of the issue as possible in order to have a really good discussion at the board table.
Fantastic. Well, some great tips from both of you. Amazing experience that you've both got. And I very much hope that those listening to this podcast can kind of bear all of that in mind when they're working with boards. It's really, really important that there's a good relationship between non-executives and executives. Obviously, we're all trying to push in the same direction in tricky territory sometimes, and have got complementary roles. So I'm very grateful to you both and wish you both well, and your regulators too. Thank you, Joe Clift from the General Osteopathic Council and Helen Phillips of the General Dental Council, both of you with many other roles besides. Thank you also to our sound engineer, Neil Bowerman of Bowerman Audio Productions. And as I say, I hope those of you listening have found the discussion interesting. Do let your colleagues know, especially if those colleagues work with boards and non-executives. We're going to discuss more issues of interest in future podcasts. There's material and events on the Institute of Regulation's website, ioregulation.org. And that's it from this Regulation podcast with me, Marcial Boo. Good luck with your own regulatory challenges, and do stay in touch to help UK regulation become the best it can. Goodbye.